Hello, everyone. I'm Rabbi Leon A. I'm the president of the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies. I live here in Jerusalem with my family, my wife Dasi, and our 3 kids. And Dasi and I are former members of BJ when we lived in New York. I love BJ. I love the community that you build and sustain. And it's a pleasure to share a little bit of Torah with you from Jerusalem. My family and I made aliyah about 6 years ago from Sag Harbor, New York, and really welcome this opportunity to engage in some study with you. I want to look today with you at the highlight of the Yom Kippur liturgy, which is Seder Ha-Avodah, the Avodah service, part of the Musaf service of Yom Kippur. Seder Ha-Avodah is a poetic recollection, and it's a kind of literary recreation of the ceremony of Yom Kippur as it was performed in the Torah itself, Leviticus chapter 16, and in the first and second temple. And after the destruction of the second temple, the rabbis responded by, as you know, creating new religious paradigms that would also achieve kapara, atonement, and they did so through developing more fully concepts such as teshuvah, repentance, such as tefillah, prayer, and through the greater development of the idea of tzedakah, charity. And yet the original ritual of Yom Kippur, with all of its powerful drama of the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, immersing himself in a mikveh 5 times and changing his clothes and going into the Holy of Holies with a rope around his neck and placing the sins of Israel on a scapegoat and sending the goat out into the wilderness. All of that drama was too powerful in the Jewish imagination to just consign it to the realm of history. And so Seder Ha-Avodah emerged as a way that allowed the rabbis to adapt this ancient practice and to turn it into liturgy, in essence, to show how words could come to replace the very thing that the words themselves describe. And it's that idea that is one of the reasons that I think it provides such a compelling and challenging opportunity for liberal Jews. The notion that words can replace the very acts they describe. The literary genius of the Jewish people is evidenced throughout this liturgy in terms of the various piyutim, the religious poetry that were written over the centuries to frame the narrative of everything that took place. All of the high priest's preparations and his entrance into the Holy of Holies that one day a year. Largely, we could say that the roots of Seder Ha-Avodah lie in the Mishnah in Tractate Yoma. That tractate's an unusual tractate because it's really distinguished by a narrative style. And probably the first Avodah service was simply reading from Tractate Yoma. And as that Mishnah became adapted through the years to make it more compatible with the synagogue service, to make it more liturgical, we have the origins of the Avodah service, so that by the 4th or 5th century, there emerges a kind of classic form for the Avodah service. And that structure takes the following form. First, it begins with an introductory piyut, a poem that provides a context for the Yom Kippur ritual. These are usually acrostics, aleph bet poems that start with the creation of the world and then go through biblical history until we get to Aaron and his sons and the performance of the Yom Kippur rite. There's a variety of different piyutim that do this. They almost all have the same form of going from creation to the performance of the Yom Kippur ritual. The most common one in Ashkenazi communities is called Ata Yatzarta. Those are the opening words. And the most common in the Sephardic tradition is Ata Konanta, but there are many more. The second piece of the Avodah service is the narrative of the Yom Kippur ritual itself, really an expansion of Mishnah Yoma that includes, as a highlight, the 3 confessions that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, makes. First, for himself and his household. Second, for all the Kohanim, all the priests. And the third, for the entire nation of Israel. And it draws in the description of this ritual, not just from rabbinic texts, but also from the Apocrypha, from texts that weren't included in the Hebrew Bible, texts like Ben Sira and other Second Temple texts. And each time the high priest makes this confession using the actual name of God, the congregation prostrates themselves and says the words which are really the leitmotif of Yom Kippur, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto La'olam Va'ed. The narrative section concludes with the successful exit of the high priest and the idea that atonement has been achieved for Israel. And then the third section of Seder Ha-Avodah is some kind of prayer that acknowledges that we can't perform these acts any longer. And this is part of the Avodah service that attempts to bridge the gap between then and now, to mind the gap, as the New York City subway would have us do. And in minding that gap, I think there's particular opportunities outside of the Orthodox world to make the case for how valid the practices that emerged in their stead are. Seder Ha-Avodah has some profound ideas that can be easily translated into a contemporary context. And I want to go through quickly 7 of those contemporary themes, those themes that have particular resonance for our time. First, is the need to give is even greater than the need to receive. I want to just repeat that. The need for human beings to give is much greater than our desire to receive. That the Avodah service inspires us to rethink sacrifice as a form of gift giving, where the desire to give back to God is paramount, and where, because of the tremendous gap that exists between us and God, there is a real uncertainty and anxiety about whether our gift will be accepted. This is an idea that I really learned to appreciate through the writings of Moshe Halbertal in his book called On Sacrifice. The second idea is that there's something exceptional and maybe even unjust about the nature of Yom Kippur, where even sins that are committed b'mezid, intentionally, deliberately, could be forgiven with true repentance. And that idea that even deliberate sins could be forgiven on Yom Kippur runs against the prophetic impulse for justice. We can see an example of this in Jeremiah chapter 7, where the prophet says, mend your ways and actions, and I will let you dwell in this place. Don't put your trust in illusions and say, Heichal Adonai, Heichal Adonai, Heichal Adonai Hema. Don't say the temple of the eternal, the temple of the eternal, the temple of the eternal are these. No, says Jeremiah, if you really mend your ways and actions, if you execute judgment between one person and another, if you do not oppress the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, if you do not shed the blood of the innocent in this place, if you do not follow other gods to your own detriment, then, only then will I let you dwell in this place and the land that I gave to your forefathers for all time. So we have here the notion that that the theology of Yom Kippur is not exactly or not fully the theology of Jeremiah and the other prophets, and that there is a power to the day that is being considered and played with imaginatively through Seder Ha-Avodah, which includes the forgiveness of deliberate sins. That may be something that we object to, but the opportunity to have that discussion and to imagine a possibility where, with true contrition and repentance, that even sins that were performed deliberately could be erased, could be covered over, kapara, as a result of the day, is something that Seder Ha-Avodah is raising for us to think about. The third idea is about God's proximity. Jacob Milgram, Professor Jacob Milgram, Alav HaShalom, wrote and taught about the ways in which the pagan understanding that Judaism adapted and changed was the following. Pagans believed that the gods could be driven out of their houses by demons. Judaism took that idea and said, God has a house, the temple in Jerusalem, and the only demons that can drive out God from God's house are human sin. The demons that can drive God out of God's house is human sin. And so we need Yom Kippur, this one day a year, to cleanse the sanctuary so that God won't be driven out of God's house and won't be driven away from our world. There was probably a kind of understanding of an almost magnetic force that drew human sin to the Beit HaMikdash, to the temple in Jerusalem. And so the theme in which human sin pollutes the temple becomes really demonstrative of the way in which we are reminded through Seder Ha-Avodah and through Yom Kippur that human action can drive God away from our world. The fourth idea is the aspirational and the real aspects of the temple service and the gap between them. There are numerous stories to draw upon from rabbinic literature that emphasize the gap between what we wanted and hoped the temple would be and what it actually was. Masechet Yoma in the Mishnah records a story of one young Kohen who trips another young Kohen in order to perform the honor of Trumat Hadeshen, clearing away the day's previous ashes. And the Mishnah is acknowledging, it's telling us that after that they instituted a lottery, so that wouldn't happen. But it's acknowledging that even in the house of God, people don't live up to our expectations and God's expectations, that the young priests working in the temple were not reflective of the ideal. They were reflective of the real, and we're troubled by that. The Mishnah is troubled by that. The Talmud, in discussing the Mishnah, brings in a Braita, an ancient rabbinic teaching dating from the time of the Mishnah, that has another version of that troubling story that is much more serious, which is that no, it wasn't that one young Kohen tripped another. It was the one young Kohen stabbed another to death in order to perform the mitzvah of clearing away the ashes. It's a painful and beautiful text, which, because Seder Ha-Avodah is so focused on the right of the temple, it becomes an opportunity for us to think about all of the institutions that we hold up as ideal and how they actually measure up in terms of the real. And what are we doing about the gap that exists between what we want those institutions to be and what they actually are? That could be our synagogue, it could be our schools, it could be our government, it could be Congress, it could be our nation. And so this idea of Seder Ha-Avodah is located in the ideal of what the temple was and did, and yet we also have a literary record and reckoning with what the temple actually was. The sixth idea is that today each of us is a Kohen Gadol. What are the implications, a high priest? What are the implications of saying that now that the temple has been destroyed, in reading Seder Ha-Avodah, what are the implications of saying that each one of us is a high priest? What might that call us to do? What might that call us to be in the world? And finally, the seventh idea that I want us to take away from Seder Ha-Avodah. This whole Avodah ritual emphasizes the communal nature of seeking atonement. That the fate of the entire nation was in the balance, while the Kohen Gadol was inside the Holy of Holies. And the relief that the entire nation experiences and the joy of Yom Kippur as a result of the high priest emerging alive from the Holy of Holies is something that could be for us a kind of corrective to an increasingly individualistic form of spirituality. Seder Ha-Avodah reminds us that the experience of Yom Kippur is communal, not just in the sense that many separate individuals come together to do their teshuvah, but that we're also seeking a kapara, an atonement for the entire nation. So let's allow this to correct a world in which we see so much through the lens of the individual. Let's use this as an opportunity to remind us that Judaism imagines that peak spiritual experiences are those that are shared with others, those that take place within a minyan, within a community that becomes the microcosm of the entire Jewish people. The ritual of Seder Ha-Avodah reminds us of that, and how Yom Kippur, in addition to all the personal work we do, is a national collective experience. I want to wish you and your family and all of BJ a Shana Tova U'Metuka. May this be a year of growth and renewal and learning. We would love to have you visit us at Pardes in Jerusalem, or to take advantage of listening to our podcasts or our online classes, pardes.org.il. And I hope we'll have an opportunity to study together in person in the year ahead. Shana Tova, thank you so much. Great to learn with all of you.